Picture this. A man walks out of prison after nearly a decade behind bars. He's got nothing, no job, no savings, no prospects. So he sets up a charity. The goal? Help prisoners reintegrate into society. Give people on the margins a second chance. Build something good from the wreckage of a wasted life. And it works. Real people turn their lives around. Real stories of change. An organization that does exactly what it says on the tin. Now picture the same man, 30 years later, standing in an Auckland courtroom. The judge has just ordered him to hand over nearly $15 million, 5 Auckland properties, 2 bank accounts, a vehicle, and the spiritual home of one of New Zealand's most feared motorcycle gangs. The charity is still running, and the question that nobody in that courtroom could fully answer, was any of it ever real? What you're about to hear is not a story about a criminal pretending to be good. It's more complicated than that. And that's exactly what makes it one of the most unsettling cases in New Zealand's history. Hit subscribe now, because this goes somewhere most people aren't ready for. To understand Wayne Doyle, you have to start at the beginning. Not the courtroom, not the gang pad, not the $15 million judgment. Glen Innes, East Auckland, the 1960s. A group of teenage misfits with no money, no direction, and no particular future ahead of them. The kind of kids that every generation produces, and every generation forgets about, until they become impossible to ignore. They called themselves the Headhunters. What started as a loose collection of young men from the same neighborhood slowly hardened into something else entirely. By the time methamphetamine exploded across New Zealand in the early 2000s, the Headhunters, particularly the East chapter based at 232 Marua Road in Mount Wellington, had muscled their way into the center of it. Written on the wall of that gangpad, a quote from The Godfather, "Real power can't be given, it must be taken." Doyle didn't write those words. But by the time police raided that building in 2017, every investigator in the room understood exactly who they were written for. Doyle didn't build the Headhunters, but he became the man it was impossible to imagine without. A confrontation between headhunters and rival gang King Cobras ends with the death of King Cobra's member Siausi Evalu. Wayne Doyle and Graham Chok Tiawa are convicted of murder under New Zealand's joint enterprise law, which allows a murder conviction for anyone who participates in a confrontation that results in death, even if they didn't deliver the fatal blow. Doyle knew who did, he never said. Not to police, not in court, not to anyone. That silence cost him years of his life. He was convicted in 1985, released on parole in 1994. But here's what that silence bought him. In the world Doyle inhabited, the man who takes the weight and says nothing is the man everyone owes everything to. He didn't just protect someone that day, he demonstrated something that no amount of violence or money could have purchased. That he could be trusted with the thing that mattered most, the truth. From that moment, Wayne Doyle's authority wasn't built on fear alone. It was built on something far more durable, loyalty that had been paid for in years. The silence in 1984 became the foundation of everything that followed. Wayne Doyle walks out of prison, and almost immediately, he sets up a charitable trust. That was then, this is now. Known as Twitten. The stated purpose: help former prisoners reintegrate into society, support people on bail and home detention, reach the people that mainstream New Zealand had already written off. And here's the part that nobody wants to sit with. Twitten actually helped people, real stories, real change, for at least some of the men and women who came through its doors. So here is the question that this case forces us to ask, and that no courtroom could fully answer. Did Wayne Doyle genuinely believe he was doing good? Not as a cover story, not as a performance for a judge, but actually, in some part of his mind, did he believe that running a rehabilitation charity and running a criminal empire were two things that could coexist? Two sides of the same man, both equally real. There's a name for this in psychology: moral licensing. It's what happens when the brain uses good deeds as permission slips for bad ones. When doing something genuinely positive creates an internal sense of credit that quietly gets spent on behavior that would otherwise feel unacceptable. The brain doesn't experience this as hypocrisy. It experiences it as balance. And that's what makes Wayne Doyle genuinely difficult to categorize. Not a cartoon villain, not a misunderstood saint, something more unsettling than either. A man who may have believed, on some level, that both things were true at the same time. Doyle was never a formal trustee of Twitten. His name didn't appear on the paperwork. On paper, he had no official connection to the organization at all. In practice, he ran it alone. He made financial decisions unilaterally. He moved money between the trust's 10 separate bank accounts without consultation. He controlled the organization as though it belonged to him, because, the court found, it effectively did. Justice Peter Andrew described those 10 separate bank accounts as likely a deliberate strategy, designed to blur the line between legal and illegal income across as many entry points as possible. And then there was this. At one point, a senior New Zealand police officer was publicly listed as a trustee of Twitten, without his knowledge, without his consent. He found out the same way everyone else did. This was not an administrative oversight. This was a demonstration of how completely Doyle felt he could operate without consequence. Police traced $72,000 in donations back to a woman whose partner had been convicted of importing nearly 1 kilogram of methamphetamine. The court found that money was tainted, and it had found its way into Doyle's financial world through the trust. The charity wasn't just a cover, it was the engine room. Operation Coin spanned nearly a decade. In 2017, police executed search warrants across multiple Auckland properties, including the Headhunters East Chapter headquarters at 232 Marua Road. They seized $275,000 in cash found at the Marua Road pad alone. They restrained 5 properties across Auckland, Freeman's Bay, New Lynn, Mount Wellington, and others. Then they started building the case. 33 affidavits, financial analysts, Ministry of Social Development investigators, covert surveillance records going back 2 decades, phone intercepts from historic drug investigations showing Doyle with direct knowledge of how Headhunters members were making their money, and in at least one instance, demanding his cut. More than 9,000 pages of evidence in total. In October 2023, 6 years after the assets were first restrained, the civil trial finally began in the Auckland High Court. It ran for 4 weeks, the longest hearing ever conducted under the Criminal Proceeds Recovery Act. A decade of work. 4 weeks in court. Nearly 10 months of deliberation before Justice Peter Andrew delivered his verdict. 27 August 2024. Justice Peter Andrew released his decision. He rejected Doyle's claim to be merely a senior member of the gang, finding the evidence of his leadership role to be overwhelming and compelling. The court found that Doyle had established the East Chapter of the Headhunters specifically to promote and profit from the criminal offending of its members, who paid a portion of their earnings directly to him. Members contributed 20% of illegal income into the central fund Doyle controlled. Methamphetamine was pressed into pills bearing the Headhunters 88 trademark. Dealers paid royalties. Anyone caught using the 88 branding without authorization was taxed, sometimes violently. Seized vehicles were turned into lottery prizes, with winners pre-selected while everyone else believed they had a fair chance. The forfeiture orders, $14.8 million. 5 Auckland properties including 232 Marua Road, $275,000 in cash, 2 bank accounts, 1 vehicle. Police Commissioner Andrew Costa said, Mr. Doyle set up the East Chapter of the Headhunters so as to promote and profit from the criminal offending of its members. This sends a very clear message to all gangs and organized crime groups. Police will come for you. Doyle's lawyer, Ron Mansfield KC, immediately announced his intention to appeal, arguing the judgment relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and testimony from anonymous witnesses who could not be cross-examined. The appeal is ongoing. Here's what the $14.8 million judgment doesn't answer. It doesn't tell us whether Wayne Doyle ever genuinely cared about the people Twitten helped. It doesn't tell us whether the man who stayed silent in 1984, who took a murder conviction rather than give someone else up, ever experienced a moment of genuine doubt about the life he was living. It doesn't tell us whether moral licensing is a defense, or an explanation, or just another way of saying that human beings are capable of holding contradictions that would break the logic of any courtroom. What the judgment does tell us is this: the structure Doyle built, the trust, the trademark, the lottery, the 20% tithe, the properties registered in names that didn't trace back to him, was sophisticated enough to survive for 3 decades before it was dismantled. And it was dismantled not through a criminal conviction, but through a civil proceeding that only required the balance of probabilities. The law didn't need to prove Wayne Doyle was guilty beyond reasonable doubt. It only needed to show that on the balance of the evidence, the money wasn't clean. That distinction matters, because it means Doyle walks away without a new criminal conviction, without new prison time, with his version of events, that he was a senior member, not the boss, still technically unproven in a criminal court. The assets are gone. The argument continues. The hardest question this case leaves us with isn't a legal one, it's a human one. Can a person do genuine good and genuine harm at the same time? Not as a performance, not as a strategy, but as 2 authentic expressions of the same person? Psychology says yes. Courts aren't built to answer that question, and that gap between what the law can prove and what's actually true about a human being is exactly the space that organized crime has always lived in. For our community here in Aotearoa, the lesson isn't simply that charitable trusts can be misused. We knew that. The lesson is that the most dangerous systems aren't the ones built on obvious evil. They're the ones built on enough real good to make the rest of it invisible. Wayne Doyle's appeal is still before the courts. The Headhunters East chapter pad at 232 Marua Road is forfeit to the Crown, and the question of whether any of it was ever real remains unanswered. What do you reckon? Is it possible to genuinely believe you're doing good while building something that causes that much harm?